And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to
Hey, Praise.
We all good, brother?
Yeah, I'm back. I don't know what happened. I got booted or something, but I'm all good.
Well, can they hear us? He said everybody's saying no sound, Praise. And if you look at the live stream, what's going on, man?
Yeah, are we live?
Checking right now. It should be live now. We can
Well,
hear
just let
you
us
now.
know.
They can hear now.
Okay, good. Okay, guys, sorry about that. Little technical difficulties, but we are good to go. We've got a good debate ahead of us. Is there evidence for human evolution? Round two with David Neff here. First debate was on Modern Day Debate. You can check that out there on his channel and on mine. So, a couple announcements you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. We've got Kent Hovind and Ron Garrett. They're going to be debating, is there reasonable evidence for evolution, next week, the 9th. So that's a lot to look forward to. And the 23rd will be Kent Hovind versus Dr. Dan Cardinal. You would have seen him yesterday on Modern Day Debate, debating Brother Salvador Cordova. So lots to look forward to. Today's going to be a flexible, kind of formal, informal debate. We're going to have openings roughly about 12 minutes, maybe a little less, a little bit longer, followed by a discussion, quick closings, and a question and answer portion. Super chats will be read first, and questions, please make sure you're tagging Praise I Am That I Am. He'll be taking, for the most part, the moderation duties. So tag him, and we'll make sure we have a good Q&A tonight. So looking forward to this one. Before we get into the openings, though, I'll let's break the ice a little bit. I'll hand it over to David if he wants to plug in his channel or maybe advertise a couple debates he's got scheduled in the next month or so. David, thanks for joining me today.
All right. Thank you so much, Standing, for having me on. I really appreciate it. I have debated Standing in the past on Modern Day Debate, and I also debated Praise I Am That I Am when the question is Jesus the Jewish Messiah. You can view that debate on my channel, and you can also view that debate on his channel as well. I have done numerous debates in the past, and I have also debated Kent Hovind twice. Our first debate was on Noah's flood, and the second debate was on evolution. And our next debate, it will be a two-part debate on August the 6th and August the 27th. Those debates will be on radiometric dating, age of the Earth, limiting factors, and the geological column. So that's a lot to look forward to. And my next debate with Standing will be on the radiometric dating as well. So a lot to look forward to on that end.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Yeah, you're definitely no stranger to debates. You've got a few good ones. That's why this is going to be a good debate. I think this is going to be a good discussion. I'm really looking forward to this. So, yeah, thanks for doing it. Let's I guess we're going to go right into the opening statements. Since David is the affirmative tonight, is there evidence for human evolution? So, David, whenever you're ready. If you got to share a screen, that's fine too. We got Praise here, the phenomenal producer. So he'll make sure that your screen is shared.
Perfect. Already. Yeah, let's go. All right, human evolution. Once again, thank you, Standing, so much for being flexible and agreeing to debate me on this topic. First, let's go over some of the issues with common design versus common ancestry. Common design is not observable. We can't observe God creating new organisms and new life forms. There's no real way to test it, and there's no real way to falsify it. No matter what evidence I bring forth, Standing can always say, "Well, does God did it?" Which, of course, is not falsifiable. It's not measurable, and there's no mechanisms behind it. Common ancestry, on the other hand, is observable. We do observe speciation. We observe lineages diverging from a single common ancestor. We can test it. It is falsifiable. It is measurable, and it does have mechanisms, namely mutations, natural selections, and other things as well. So both the biblical model and the scientific model do make predictions. The biblical creation, we should be able to trace our origins back to the Middle East about 4,500 to 6,000 years ago. We should find a genetic bottleneck that brings human population down to only 8 people about 4,500 years ago. We should never find other species of humans, and we should not have a common ancestor with any other species. Science, we predict that we should be able to trace our origins back to Africa about 100,000, 300,000 years ago. We should find a close DNA match with other great apes. We should have a similar number of chromosomes with the other great apes. We should be able to find other species of humans, and we should also be able to trace back a common ancestor with the other great apes. Here are some key questions that Standing for Truth must answer. How did humans go from 8 people alive to billions in less than 4,500 years? Are the other human fossils, such as Neanderthals and Erectus, pre-flood or are they post-flood? How did they evolve and go extinct so quickly? How many people were around after the Great Flood to create the Tower of Babel? How did human population and the animal population rebound so quickly that there's basically no trace in the historical record? And how did these humans migrate from Turkey, Middle East to all around the globe where we see today? And finally, are the other Homo species the same kind as us? And as I already mentioned, how did they evolve and go extinct so quickly? So first of all, let's talk about ancestors. This is a DNA test that I did a few years ago from Ancestry.com. As we can see, I am a European, obviously, but I am also a Southerner. I was born in Arkansas, and my biological mother was born in Alabama. And it's quite fascinating that they were actually able to trace not only where from Europe I came from, but they were also able to trace exactly where my family settled to in Alabama and Georgia and in Tennessee and in this section. And they were able to give a timeline for roughly when this happened. So we can learn so much just from learning from about our DNA. So from the using the same principles that determined my origins, we use the same principle to determine that anatomically modern humans originated in about southern Africa around 200,000 years ago. And here is a paper in Nature just published last year in 2019. Genetic divergence points to a sustained 70,000-year-long existence of the LO lineage before and out of homeland northeast southwestern dispersal between 130 and 110,000 years ago. The paleoclimate proxy and model data suggests that increased humidity opened greater corridors first to the northeast, then to the southwest. Subsequent drying of the homeland corresponds to a sustained effect population size. And using this mitochondrial DNA, we were able to have create a map of where and when our human population spread. And this is through the haplogroups and all the other techniques. So if Standing for Truth wants to reject this, he better have a good reason to. Here are some misconceptions. The most recent common ancestor is not the first human to have existed. Rather, as the name suggests, they are the most recent common ancestor. If the creationist model was correct, then Noah and his wife would be the most recent common ancestor of us all. even though the creationist model would say Adam and Eve were the first humans. If that were true, then all of us should be able to trace our origins 4,500 years ago to the Middle East, yet our lineage goes much further back into Africa. And just to illustrate this point, Europeans are able to have their most recent common ancestor traced 600 to 1,000 years ago, even though we all know our lineage goes much further back than just 1,000 years ago. So I actually want to kind of take a quick look at the cat evolution. This is actually from a creationist paper, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute. We are able to take the DNA and do the DNA sequencing and the genomic sequencing, and we're able to create a phylogenetic tree and figure out when and where the most recent common ancestor of the various cat kind here diverged. And this is quite interesting because this paper, they argue that based on previously reported hybridizations, cats have long been considered to belong to a single basic type. Again, this is from a creationist paper. This is not from the secular journals. So again, these are creationists who accept the principles here and are able to use it to create a model, a creationist model of how the cats diverged and diversified from creation. And they continue, the phylogenetic history of cats is complex and has been controversial for a long time, primarily because of the extremely rapid speciation events that took place during the Tertiary period. And recently, based on DNA sequencing, studies relationships between the various lineages and species could be clarified. The DNA analysis of the spectrum of genes, along with the modern statistical techniques, have revealed that the extant cat family can be subdivided into 8 lineages. Again, this is a creationist paper, not a secular science paper. And this is actually the paper where they actually got it from. It's quite interesting because this is from a paper in Science. Basically, all what the creationists did is erase the dates that don't correspond with their preconceived ideas and just draw a little kitty at the beginning of the phylogenetic tree. And this paper in Science points out that the phylogenetic relations among the felidae species are able to be reconstructed pretty reliably. So if he wants to reject this, then he has to reject this. If he wants to reject what we can know from human genetics, then he has to reject what we can know from cat genetics as well. For example, chromosomes. Human chromosomes have 23 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 46 chromosomes. However, the other great apes have 48 chromosomes. And one of them is actually fused, namely the human chromosome number 2 is fused. And a paper here showed exactly how it happened. And this happens within the created kinds as well. I highly doubt that my opponent will disagree that horses, zebras, and donkeys are the same created kind, whatever that means. Yet we see that there's a significant variety of chromosomal difference between these created kinds. So DNA comparison. If humans and the other great apes share a common ancestor, then we should see similarities in our DNA. As it turns out, humans and chimps are about 95 to 99% genetically similar, confirming what evolution would predict. And we, of course, are able to create a phylogenetic tree based upon the information that we learned. Again, if my opponent wants to reject this, then he has to reject what we learned about the cat evolution as well. Now let's get into some of the fossils. Because of course, evolution would predict that the further we go back in time, the more ape-like our fossils should represent. And here is Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, dated to about 3.2 million years ago. They lived in East Africa. The species is represented by over 400 individuals. They were not chimps at all. They were fully bipedal and they not walk on their knuckles. Their brain size is about a third of that of a modern human. Next, we get to Homo habilis, Handyman, average height about 4 feet 3 inches. probably the earliest member of the Homo genus. He was able to make stone tools, and they had a cranial capacity of about 612 cc. Then we get to Homo heidelbergensis. They were the first to build shelter, and they had about 1280 cc. So again, as we're progressing in time, we're seeing that the brain size is becoming much larger, and they lived from about 300,000 to 600,000 years ago. Homo naldi, approximately 4 feet 9 inches tall, they had a cranial capacity of about 560 cc, and they were possibly the first to actually bury the dead. Next, Homo erectus lived about 1.89 million and 110,000 years ago. They lived for a very long time, very successful. The height ranged from about 4 feet 9 inches to 6 feet 1 inch, and they actually were able to spread throughout Asia, Africa, and even into Europe a little bit. Then we get to the Neanderthals. They were able to make diverse tools, arts, and even possibly musical instruments. They had about 1,500 cc of the cranial capacity, which is actually larger than modern humans, represented by hundreds of fossil specimens. They cared for the disabled, and the DNA analysis actually shows that we last shared a common ancestor about 800,000 years ago. Again, if my opponent wants to reject this, then he has to reject what we learned about the cat evolution, and he has to reject the same science that shows that Europeans had a last recent common ancestor about 1,000 years ago. And through genetic analysis, could only produce offspring from male Neanderthals with female humans. And so what do creationists think of all this? Well, here's a paper here that says that Homo rudolfensis and the Australopithecus and are all part of the humankind, the human holobaromin. However, another paper disagrees with that and says that they were not. This study provides further evidence that Homo naldi is indeed not a member of the human holobaromin, but rather to the Australopithecus. So again, there's a debate both in the secular literature and in the creationist literature as well as to exactly where these belong. And if special creation was in fact the case, then there shouldn't be a debate anywhere. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing Sandy's opening.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much there, David. Lots of good points. Really good opening. Very informative. This is going to be a lot of fun. I can tell you worked hard on that, so I appreciate that. This is going to be a good discussion. So you went for about 12 minutes and about 30 seconds.
Oh, perfect. I was almost right on the dot.
Yeah, you did great. No rush on this channel. If you need a little bit more time, that's totally cool with me. So I'll probably take roughly the same amount of time. I'll share my screen real quick here. And yeah, you got a lot of good questions. So before I get started, when we get to the discussion portion, if you want, we can take them one by one and have some fun. So let me. Perfect. Okay, let me reset this. Okay, let's go here. So yeah, I mean, like I said, you got good questions there. We can discuss those in the discussion. You brought up genetic sequencing, Heidelbergensis, chromosome 2 fusion, the haplogroups, for example, habilis, the handyman, Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, Naledi, cat kind. I got a lot of notes here, so it should be fun. Hit the timer here. Oh, I'm sorry, David. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, if you want, we can go through our PowerPoints again and discuss the points together one by one if you want.
Yeah, we can do that. I'll once I'm done my opening here, and I just wanted to represent your opening as good as possible, so I took as many notes as I can. But yeah, we can go back to the PowerPoints during the discussion, and I'll try and answer those questions for you one by one.
All right, yeah, let's go.
Okay,
I look forward to it. I will mute myself, and good luck.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks again, David, for your opening. Let's get this going. Okay. So debate human evolution round 2 with David Neff. Is there evidence for ape to man evolution? What we observe in the fossil record is death, degeneration, and extinction. And this is all consistent with the Genesis starting point. These conclusions are all documented in great detail by Dr. John Sanford and Christopher Roop in the must-read book, Contested Bones. In a nutshell, they point out that there are a couple different things going on in the fossil record that give the evolutionary community the impression that these bones are transitional. One is that they are often artificial species that consist of a mixture of ape and human beings. Therefore, they would be considered artificial. For example, with Australopithecus sediba and Homo habilis. And this is often done unintentionally. These sites where they would go to look for the next big missing links, for example, they would bring back their findings, and oftentimes the bones would be in fragments. Consequently, bones of multiple species would then be confused as one single species. And this is discussed in the paleoanthropological community. You can read it in their papers directly. So they have got two separate species very often, these species being humans and apes, and these species are being found together at these sites. The bones are intermingled, essentially. The other issue Dr. John Sanford and Christopher Roop point out is that these bones claim to be transitional all show pathology consistent with small inbred tribes post-Babel. They also point out the fact that this is a common theme found in the fossil record. There has been a recent paper that corroborates this claim. You can see it here on screen. The author of this paper points out that oftentimes these bones that are found to be old are also riddled with pathology and disease. The paper also points out the fact that this pathology cannot be due to chance. There's just too much. The people that are looking for intermediate forms will typically pick up the unique bones. These are the atypical bones they hope are evidence for the ape to man story. We know these bones are the result of rapid entropic decay. This paper is fascinating. I recommend anybody read it that's interested in this topic. So what do we see in the present, though? We observe a great diversity of ape forms. We observe a great diversity of human forms. We see this same type of variation in the fossil record. As a matter of fact, we find it to be even more diverse. Although we see such great assortment in both the present and the past, it is not challenging to distinguish ape bones from human bones if the skeletons are substantially intact and not too fragmented. Now, the so-called pre-humans that David points to here, such as Homo naledi, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, which some people may understand as the hobbits, and Homo neanderthal, were not pre-human. They were all members of the human species. The anomalous features, often regarded as primitive or transitional, were the result of accelerated genetic degeneration due to post-Babel isolation. The ripple effect of this isolation was prolonged inbreeding. And this is a reasonable explanation. You see this all the time. For example, I've got paper here on mammoths that were highly inbred in the past and were in genetic meltdown. You can see high genetic load in an old isolated butterfly population. Tons and tons of sources and papers on this, for example. So now, since this would mostly be due to post-Babel dispersion of people groups, many of the people groups would have migrated to parts of the earth that were less than ideal. If a people group became isolated and inbreeding resulted as a consequence, rapid genetic degeneration would occur. Harsh environmental conditions in the immediate post-flood world would also lead to disease, nutrition deficiencies, and environmental-related genetic degeneration. There were many negative factors at play in the immediate post-flood and post-Babel world that would lead to accelerated genetic decay of small people groups. And this is exactly what we find. This means that many of the troubling human fossils that David here would say are pre-human, that he pointed to in his opening, are better understood to be devolution. For example, morphological and genetic degeneration. We are told these fossils are evidence for evolution, when in fact this is just more evidence for genetic entropy. The so-called primitive features that apologists of ape-to-man evolution have pointed to in Hobbit, Erectus, Naledi, and Neanderthal, three of which David covered in his opening, do not actually show they were less than human. They were fully human. They were all made in the image of God. More correctly, they were human communities that were persistently inbred and were in genetic decline. The alternative explanation, for example, literal Adam and Eve, makes much more better sense of the data. For example, all human beings are profoundly similar genetically, and this points directly to Adam and Eve. Dave and I, if we have time, we can talk about this new study that has come out that suggests that over 90% of species originated at the same time with humans. This was a fascinating study. Right here, a peer-reviewed paper by Dr. Nathaniel Jensen shows that there's only about 4,500 years worth of mutations in the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA take us back to just two common ancestors just thousands of years ago, and testable predictions have been made on both the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA. David spent some time here on the haplogroups, for example. Mostly the data he's looking at is based on phylogeny assumptions, the fossil record, for example, deep time assumptions. But as we can see here, genetics and genes and traits, that's what's inherited, sperm and egg. Credit goes to Dr. Nathaniel Jensen on this mitochondrial DNA map that points us right back to Noah's three daughters-in-law. As you can see here, the three main haplogroups, L, M, and N. This is all based on DNA and not phylogeny-based assumptions. This also makes testable predictions on the history of civilization. So we can talk about that a little bit later. But since the burden of proof is on David here today, let's get back to the evidence for evolution. He did bring up the chromosome 2 fusion. So I just want to strongly emphasize the fact today to the audience that the absolute best evidence for human evolution has been overturned and is now in favor of the creation model of ancestry. Let's go over a few of the so-called best lines of evidence for human evolution, other than the fossils I have already covered. The entire junk DNA paradigm has been overturned, and the chromosome 2 fusion has been overturned as well. We know that the fusion site is a functional element inside an RNA helicase long non-coding RNA gene. The area is far too degenerate, and there is lack of evidence for the so-called cryptic centromere. How does David here today address these problems? Evolutionists often point to homology, transitional forms, and nested hierarchies when trying to push their philosophical belief in universal ancestry. Well, we know that human engineers design in homologous patterns. Across the globe, as you can see here, we see shared designs and even shared blueprints. What about the so-called existence of transitional forms? Well, think of a military vehicle that blends the features of both a land vehicle and a vehicle built for the ocean, an amphibious assault vehicle. Creationists too predict interesting mosaics. Nested hierarchies, as is shown here, are simply characteristics of design and reflective of God's hierarchical nature. Lastly, the best examples of evolutionary change are either reductive, degrading to the function of the organism, or simply general organismal adaptation or epigenetic. There are no examples of evolutionary change necessary to take their fish to fishermen. Mutations are detrimental, and natural selection is a fine-tuning mechanism that keeps the species as strong as it can be. We've touched on the mitochondrial DNA clock earlier, and the predictions that Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has put forth. I'd like to ask David the question during the discussion portion as to whether or not the evolutionists are making predictions as to how the molecular clock and the mitochondrial DNA, you know, when does it speed up, when does it slow down, for example. So we can get into that in the discussion portion. We've got preliminary evidence, though, for genome-wide functionality. ENCODE has revealed that over 80% of our genome is actively transcribed into RNA, suggesting function. Can David refute this? A near fully functional genome makes ape-to-man evolution impossible because those deleterious mutations that are accumulating are degenerating not only the ape lineage, but also the human line. Humans are not getting better, and neither are apes. As you can see here from these numerous papers, we know that ERVs and other classes of retrotransposons accomplish many crucial functions in regulating gene expression. They help determine cell types, they help with development, and even assist in cell stress responses. What about the functional orphan genes that show independent ancestries? How does David explain this incredible class of taxonomically restricted and essential genes? These orphan genes defy universal ancestry. These genes are unique sets of coding sequences that are specific to particular organisms, and they show no consistent hierarchy. A couple more questions I'd like to see answered in the discussion portion if we get a chance. How does David explain the incredible dissimilarity between chimp and human Y chromosomes? How does David explain the low genetic diversity in human beings? Genesis tells us God created two human beings, Adam and Eve. This would severely restrict genetic diversity. Evolutionists, as always, had to invent a post hoc, ad hoc rescue device regarding the fairy tale out of Africa population bottleneck. We can discuss that as well. Let's wrap this up real quick and into a nice, neat little package. When the proponents of human evolution go wrong, is that they do not understand that this all has to do with the Tower of Babel incident. We are not witnessing the arrival of culture from ape-like or animal-like ancestors. We are observing a rediscovery of culture by people who basically lost everything once that confusion at Babel happened. When we think about the Tower of Babel and the groups of people living there and working together to produce it, we can think of it like our own community that we live in. We all have our own jobs. We've got people that work in the hospital, people who work in construction, people who make and distribute food. We've got farmers, police officers, firemen, nurses, doctors. The list goes on and on and on, of course. Not one person does it all. These jobs are broken up amongst the people to live in a functioning community. Now, we can imagine what stemmed from the confusion of the languages at the Tower of Babel scene. Maybe one group had no real practical skills at building or hunting or even farming. What does this mean? Well, this means that these groups of people deficient in these types of skills would end up living a very primitive life. Some would even look at it as prehistoric. This is exactly what we are seeing in the fossil record. We are not seeing the emergence of culture from ape-like or animal-like ancestors, as David pushes here. We are observing a rediscovery of culture by people who basically lost everything once that confusion at Babel happened. I've got a little bit of time here left, so I'll address a couple more things that he discussed. He talked about the Australopithecines. Well, they share most of their features with living apes today. They're about 3 or 4 feet tall. They've got long arms and short legs, 8 hands and feet with curved fingers and toes, opposable thumb-like toes, ape-sized and ape-shaped skulls, funnel-shaped rib cages with high-placed shoulders for suspensory behavior. So yeah, there is some uniqueness in morphology, as David pointed out here, but that means the best conclusion for anybody should be that these were just apes, nothing more than an extinct ape genus. For example, in the past, it appears, as I pointed out earlier, that there was a greater diversity of apes than are alive today. The living great apes include pan or chimpanzee, gorilla, and pongo or orangutan. Now, if they were not extinct, these Australopithecines would simply be considered a fourth hominid genus. All 4 genera share many sets of features, some unique to their own genus, and yet are all obviously ape. So I'm not too sure why people still use the Australopithecines of evidence for ape to man evolutionary advancement. It's just not the case. But yeah, it looks like I just hit the 12 to 13 minute mark. So I hope everyone enjoyed my opening, and thanks so much for listening. So I'll end it here. Stop screen. Boom. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. If you wanted to, I know I talked a lot there, David. If you wanted to take a few minutes to address a few things or pull up your questions, I mean, however you want to proceed.
All right, sure. So let's go into the meat of the issue that I brought up at the very beginning. And that is with the scientific issue with common design versus common ancestry. And the biggest problem is that there's really no way to falsify anything that you said. There's really no way to falsify common design, because the person obvious issue is that we can't observe God creating new forms. We can't observe it in the past. So again, from a scientific standpoint, how would you falsify the biblical accounts? What are some of the ways that you would say that if such evidence were presented to you, that the Bible would be falsified?
Good question. So I guess that would come down to, and I appreciate that question, because you're right. The gold standard of science is testable and falsifiable predictions. That's why I typically point to the created heterozygosity hypothesis that suggests that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve with these pre-existing functional DNA differences in elements, for example, the retrotransposons, ERVs. That hypothesis, that idea would apply universally across species. Therefore, we've made testable predictions on speciation rates. We've made testable predictions on DNA function and mutation rates as well. Therefore, if those predictions were tested, then that would at least falsify that hypothesis. Because if we're predicting that the vast majority of our genome is functional, these DNA elements that evolutionists often point to as evidence for evolution, if those really are just genomic fossils, evolutionary leftovers, if the vast majority of our genome really is junk, that would falsify that specific model. Or if the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, for example, if those predictions failed and the mutations and the observed rate went back further than 6,000 years, for example, that would also falsify that hypothesis. So there are plenty of predictions in the creation model that we can, that only future observations and tests can tell us whether or not they're true. Go ahead, David.
All right, yeah, sure. So let's start with the molecular clock, because I brought up a couple of points in that section. Would you agree with the statement that, or with the findings of the paper that I brought up, that Europeans share a most recent common ancestor about 600 to 1,000 years ago? Would you agree with, would you generally would agree with that paper?
If you're just looking at Europeans, when do they last share a recent common ancestor? You're saying about 600 to 1,000 years ago?
Yeah, that's one of the papers that I brought up. So yeah, 2013 paper in Nature, I think.
I would agree with that date if it's based on the empirical rate. For example, pedigree-based studies. But I mean, 600 to 1,000 years ago, for all Europeans sharing a recent common ancestor, that's certainly consistent with the biblical model of 6,000 to 6,500 years for Eve. So yeah, I don't see any issue with that.
All right, sure. So when I also bring up the studies that show that humans last share a common ancestor about 100,000 to 300,000 years ago, they use the same exact assumptions and predictions and data that the other study would use. So my question is to why would you reject that?
A good question. So typically when, and we can obviously look at those studies in detail, but typically when you get the dates that go above and beyond roughly the 6,000 year date, now you're getting into phylogeny-based assumptions, the phylogenetic method, for example. So you're no longer looking at the empirical rate. This goes for the Y chromosome, which we now know mutates fast. And the differences that separate us from the Y chromosomal sequence is only about a few hundred. That takes us back to just 4,500 years ago to Y chromosome Noah. These are all based on the empirical method. So anytime you look at these studies, when you're only looking at the empirically observed mutation rate for whether it's the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA, it always shows that they mutate fast. Therefore, the indication is that mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam lived just thousands of years ago. Now, when the evolutionists are doing their similar analyses, oftentimes, David, in the same paper, they're now taking the observed rate and they're saying, okay, now we need to calibrate it with the deep time evolutionary assumptions, the fossil record, for example. So when they calibrate it, now it's taking the clock back to hundreds of thousands of years. But that's based on the assumptions. Here's the issue, though. They are now invoking hypothetical mutation rates that are actually about 20-fold lower than what is observed. And then they justify this based on, like I said, certain evolutionary based assumptions. And that's okay. If you want to have that explanation, if that's what they want to do is calibrate the date, the next important approach would be, okay, we need testable predictions. That's why Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, he's using the empirically observed mutation rate, and it's taking Eve back 6,000 years ago. And he's saying, okay, now I'm going to make testable predictions on people groups. For example, in Africa, the Khoisan peoples, where their mutation rate is not yet known or measured. And he's making direct predictions and saying, this is how much I predict their DNA will change or mutate over time. So so if you're going to hold to your explanation for the deep time dates derived for the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial Eve, would you have, and it doesn't have to be you making the predictions, but are there any papers or evolutionary scientists making predictions to flow from their explanation? David, go ahead.
Like, what do you mean? Like, I don't quite understand so like what predictions would we make for our findings?
Right, because if you're gonna say that we have to calibrate the, like, do you get how do you get what I said about how they come up with the date of hundreds of thousands of years when they calibrate the date with the fossil record? Did you do you agree with that point,
Um,
or?
no, I would have to take a look at the paper that you cited. Send it to me, and I think the easiest way for me to do it is, since there's a lot of points I want to go over, is just to do a response video just on that paper and really go in depth. And I think that's the best way for me to do it, is just to sit down and really comb over the paper.
Sure, I think that's a good idea. Let's not beat a dead horse and spend too much time on just one topic. So I guess if you ask that question, can I ask a question real quick, and then we can
Yeah,
we'll
well, you're,
kind of just bounce back and forth, I guess.
yeah,
I
sure.
like
Yeah, you can ask me a question, then I have a question for you as well.
Of course. So, so I guess with the examples that you brought up when it comes to the so-called hominids, the pre-humans, Homo neanderthal, Naledi, Erectus, Heidelbergensis, for example. My explanation in the papers that I showed in the opening, where it talks about an abundance of developmental anomalies and abnormalities in the Pleistocene people, at these
Okay.
atypical features that are often pointed to as evidence for ape to man evolution being nothing more than pathology, being nothing more than rapid genetic degeneration due to isolation and inbreeding. What are your thoughts on those arguments and those studies and observations? Take your time, David.
Okay, sure. So the first is obviously that yes, there was some inbreeding going on, and even we see that in today in our species, there's been inbreeding just within Homo sapiens. But you can't just make the conclusion that they were all based on that as well. You actually have a pretty serious problem of your own. You're proposing that 4,500 years ago, there was a great flood that wiped everything out except for 8 humans. And the Bible says that actually, if you look at the genealogies, Noah and his wife didn't have any more children after the flood, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, it would have been probably. Yeah, they would have just been Noah's 3 daughters-in-law and 3 sons that would have repopulated the earth from 6 people. Correct. Yeah.
Okay, so assuming there wasn't any interbreeding going on between those 3 people, you have basically 3 sets of 2 people. And obviously, that's a significant bottleneck problem that you face in your own model, because at that point, it would be pretty much game over. Genetically, that would pretty much be functional extinction right then and there. Um, Shem and his wife, I looked at just read a little bit of the genealogy. Shem and his wife had their first child 2 years after the flood. So my question for you is, how did the human population rebound so quickly? And you talked about the Tower of Babel in your debate opening. From what I understand, the Tower of Babel was only like what 100 years after the flood. How long? How long was the Tower of Babel after the flood?
Probably about 100, 150 years ago. That's just kind of a guess. I'd have to double check, but I'd say about 150 years later after the flood.
All right, sure. So let's be generous and say 150 years after the flood. Obviously, the question must be, how did the humans and animal population rebound so incredibly quickly that they were building a tower, a huge tower, only 150 years after the flood? Take your time.
I appreciate it, David. I'll answer those very important questions as well. Definitely not the first time I've heard those arguments, so I enjoy discussing the bottleneck apparent issues. But I definitely don't want to leave the hominid fossil record just yet. So real quick before I answer that question, because I do have several papers here indicating that these so-called primitive humans were simply inbred and suffered from a special type of genetic degeneration called reductive evolution. For example, the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, which is often praised as a solid transition from your Australopithecine-like ancestors to modern-day humans, shows that they suffered from insular dwarfism, which results in the reduced body size, reduced brain volume, and various other pathologies. Another paper I showed in the opening too regarding Homo neanderthalensis. He was 40% less fit than modern humans, highly inbred, had a very high genetic load, resulting in genetic degeneration that they even say may have contributed to the disappearance of their population. Also, same thing with with Homo naledi and Homo erectus, were both highly inbred and suffered from reductive evolution. So those atypical, those anomalous features that are often pointed to in the body structure, in the skull, in the brain size, for example, are just better understood as pathology and disease. So I think that's an important point to take home.
Hold on. Can I ask a question in relationship to that? You're saying that if they're based upon inbred, shouldn't we see everything being so severely inbred, given that there's only 3 populations derived from 2 inbreeding couples?
Right, good question.
Because from what I understand, I don't think Shem shared his wife with any of the other brothers and vice versa.
I'm just because, and I'm going to answer that question. I just don't want to leave this point just because for this debate, you're in the affirmative. So this is just my rebuttal and challenges to you regarding your best examples of so-called transitional forms: Heidelbergensis, Neanderthal, Erectus, Naledi, Homo floresiensis, Sediba habilis, for example. So that's why I showed that paper by Eric Trinkos, I hope I'm saying that right, but it's titled An Abundance of Developmental Anomalies and Abnormalities in the Pleistocene People. This is in the secular literature. So this makes sense from our perspective of post-Babel dispersion and migration. Some of these subpopulations become isolated. Some of them become isolated on an island like the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, resulting in founder effects and rapid genetic degeneration. It explains all the anomalous features that somebody like Erica and Bill Ludlow have often pointed to. And the smaller brains, very good point. And then we can move on if you want to the the bottleneck according to our model. But the brain size, for example, you'll see that well, I guess like you did there too, and Bill Ludlow and Erica, for example, they'll line up smallest brain sizes to the largest brain size in a series that reflects evolution. But what's funny is reduced brain size is exactly what's expected based on this inbreeding that in reductive evolution. For example, reduced brain sizes can often be beneficial in certain conditions. An example of a condition where it could be beneficial is starvation. This is because, as you know, David, brains are energetically costly, okay? So this is evolution in reverse that you're pointing to. And these pathologies and variants can occur quickly in isolated populations, as is expected and predicted based on the biblical model post-Babel and post-flood. And even, and then I'll let you take your time on this, even the paleoanthropologists now admit that your Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo naledi, the Denisovans, for example, that they all lived together at the exact same time. So there's no real progression from an ape-like ancestor to modern humans because they all intermingled, they all interbred, coexisted, and just lining up the brain sizes from smallest to largest is kind of deceitful from the not for you, but from the paleoanthropological community, when in fact they lived at the same time. And we know that smaller brain sizes is exactly what would be expected based on the inbreeding. And I want to give you as much time as you want to comment on that. And then when you're comfortable, I'll try and answer the issues that you raised regarding my model. So go ahead there, David.
All right, sure. So I'm going to try and attack this based upon your model as well. So exactly how did the brain sizes go down so quickly and then become increasingly larger. So the Homo naledi and Neanderthals and all, which sons of Noah were they descended from?
Oh, what, like, for example, Neanderthal, all of these would be post flood people groups that, I mean, a few of them, maybe Neanderthal or Erectus, for example, maybe they migrated before the Babel incident. Chances are they probably all migrated after the Babel incident. That would explain the inbreeding. And the thing is, small brains and small bodies, let's say in the Homo floresiensis, for example, even the evolutionary community agrees that that is explained best by island dwarfism and inbreeding. When you have a small population like that, inbreeding, then those types of effects, those types of pathologies can occur really, really, really quickly.
And I agree with you, and I agree with the secular scientists that Homo florensis was based on insular dwarfism, and you also see the exact opposite, insular gigantism, as well.
Did you want me to answer the problem with, see, my point is degeneration always accelerates whenever a small population is reproductively isolated for numerous generations, as we see with the Neanderthals, Naledi especially, great evidence there. The hobbits, just really, really small people. It's because these deleterious mutations arise and they become fixed based on the inbreeding. But did you want me to answer the issues that you think, if your objection is technically, okay, well, what about your model then? Is that kind of what your objection is there, David?
Yeah, because it doesn't seem to fit your model. So obviously the question is, shouldn't there be a significant genetic deterioration that we see should be felt in our population today, for all descended from just two interbreeding couples 4,500 years ago? That seems to not compute.
So good question, and that's why I really enjoyed your opening, because you brought up a lot of good points. Real quick clarifying question before I answer that question. I've discussed it numerous times in my model, also in the book that I just released. There's vastly different explanations for the origin of DNA differences between the creation model and the evolutionary model. Do you, obviously you know that the evolutionary model explains all DNA differences as a result of genetic mistakes and mutations over time, but do you know what the creation model says is the origin for DNA differences and genetic diversity?
Sure, I'll give this the best shot I get, and of course I want to be as honest about your position as possible. I like the fact that we're kind of steel manning each other. So from what I understand is that God basically created life separately, with different kinds and all, and I guess created them heterozygous or whatever it is, and that's basically my best understanding, is that he basically created the original created kinds with all the genetic information needed to diversify into what we see today.
So good. Yeah, that's, and I always say it's important to represent the other opponent's position accurately. That's why I always do my best to represent the evolution side the best way I can. So you're right. So we explained the vast majority of genetic diversity as a result of initial created heterozygosity. That means those millions of DNA differences we see, the question is, okay, are they the result of mutations and genetic mistakes over time, like evolution would say? Or are they the result of created, front-loaded genetic diversity, okay? So that's why we predict that the vast majority of these DNA differences and elements would be functional. And that's, we know so little of the DNA language that this is a work in progress, but it's a testable prediction nonetheless. So according to our model, if all DNA differences are the result of mutations, or of created DNA diversity, that means by the time you reach the flood, bottleneck of 8 people, yeah, you'd have a few mutations accumulated, but the majority of those DNA differences are still created DNA differences. We know that inbreeding exposes the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. But if there are no genetic mistakes to come to the forefront and become fixed, there's not going to be any inbreeding problems. But guess what? Here's where it's a problem for the evolutionary model. The evolutionists explain all the millions of DNA differences as a result of genetic mistakes over time. So you got the Australopithecines evolving and accumulating genetic mutations, and then they evolved into Homo erectus, and then eventually humans. By that point in time, when you reach the out of Africa hypothetical population bottleneck, you've already got so many mutations accumulated that once the inbreeding starts, all of these recessive mutations are coming to the forefront, leading to rapid and accelerated genetic degeneration. But from a biblical perspective, in our model, there's absolutely no problem, because we start with just 2 people, and you represented this accurately, so I respect that. Then 10 generations later, we've got a single generation bottleneck of just 8 people, as you said. This occurred at the time of the flood. Both bottlenecks, according to our model, were very brief, just 1 generation. They were followed by explosive growth, and in both cases, there would be almost 0 previously accumulated mutations, and as I said earlier, no inbreeding effects. And guess what? We do see, as a human population, we have low genetic diversity. So that's exactly what is expected, and that's the question that you asked. We also see low genetic diversity in certain highly conserved mitochondrial DNA proteins. For example, the CO1 gene, that's that study that came out recently that suggests over 90% of the today's species originated at the same time in the very recent past alongside humans. So this is all in correlation with the flood bottleneck. So take your time, David. What are your thoughts on that?
All right, sure. So about the original DNA stuff, there's a couple questions I have about your model, actually. How would we know how do we test what are the original created kinds? How do we know which animals are related or of the same kind? And I guess one question I want to ask is, how did all these kinds diversify so quickly after the flood and go extinct so quickly after the flood? Because obviously, from what I understand, you're saying that Lucy, which are the Australopithecines, they are part of the 8th kind, correct?
Yeah, as I said, I guess as a rebuttal in my opening, it appears that in the past, we can see this in the fossil record, and it's what we would expect based on our model of a pre-flood world. We see greater diversity of apes and other animals than are alive today. So the living great apes, what do we have? And correct me if I'm wrong, pan or chimpanzee, gorilla, pongo, or orangutan, for example. So these are not extinct. The Australopithecines are extinct. So let's say they were alive today, they would just be considered a 4th hominid genus, because all 4 of these genus share numerous sets of features, some unique, even among the ones that are living today, some are unique within their own genus, but yet they're all obviously apes. So the Australopithecines, I agreed with you. Yeah, of course, there's some uniqueness in their morphology and anatomy, but they're nothing more than just an extinct ape genus. But when it comes to, actually, what was your question about how do we identify the created heterozygosity, or?
Yeah, how do we identify the created kinds? Like you take an orangutan and a lemur. Are they of the same created kind, or are they a distinct created kind? Because obviously there are significant differences between an orangutan and a lemur, but they're both primates, and so are they of the same created kind, or are they a distinct kind?
So that's a really good question. So we would go about identifying the kind boundary and ancestry. And I cover this in my book in great detail. We look to DNA function as well as molecular clocks. So for example, molecular clocks have already differentiated humans from the rest of the biological world. And I understand you want to look at the papers later, and we can do that. But just the empirical rate takes back Adam and Eve to under 6,500 years. It appears that based on the ENCODE results and based on the accumulating papers, that the majority of our genome is active. So that, those are the two main things. Now, when it comes to the ape kind, we can also look to speciation rates, which is why I'm going to share screen here when I get the chance and look at the number of species, for example, because when we look at the number of species of anything, for example, cats, or we can look to birds, or we can look to specific, see, the thing is, God would have created two human beings, so we'd expect low genetic diversity. God would have created populations of animals. We'd expect a bit of a higher genetic diversity. How many kinds of apes did he create? How many kinds of monkeys did he create? How many kinds went onto the ark? That's why we have to look to the molecular clocks, the DNA function, which is a work in progress, for example. But I think the speciation rates are key right now because they're in line with biblical expectations in 4,500 years. So I'm going to share a screen on some of the species numbers. That's just going to take me a few seconds due to lag. So in that few seconds, you can respond to what I said there, David. Yeah, if you wanted to respond to anything I said there, go ahead. Unless, can you see the screen?
I cannot see your screen.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I cannot see your screen.
Praise, are you there, brother? Make sure Praise is there. He's going to have to make it official. So when it comes to the numbers of species, like, for example, do you know how many species there are of cats today or birds in the world?
So I believe there's about 10,000 species of birds, and there's about, I think there's at least one here, about 48 different species of cats, from what I understand.
Actually, yeah, so it looks like you've done your homework. I imagine you can't see my screen yet?
Yeah, just came up.
Okay, good. So thank you, Praise. That's why we pay you the big bucks. So yeah, so for example, if we were to look at the cat species, I think there's only about 37. The bird species, there's only about 10,000. So if you look here, we can see rapid adaptation and evolution in real time. New bird species has evolved on the Galapagos Islands. I'll keep it there right here. Study of Darwin's finches reveals that new species can arrive quickly. So, we've made testable predictions on speciation rate since the flood. So if we have 10,000 roughly bird species today, we're going to predict about 2 or 3 every single year since the flood. We are already seeing new species today in our very own eyes. And guess what? We're studying the finches on the Galapagos Island, and we've seen it. What about the entire planet, places on this earth that we're not even looking? We're not seeing every single speciation event. Now, this makes sense. 2 to 3 since the flood, 4,500 years. Boom, you've got 10,000 bird species from a handful of bird species on the earth. Why, though? This is my question. I find it fascinating. If there's only 10,000 bird species today, and supposedly birds today evolved from a theropod-like dinosaur within, now and 65 million years ago, why aren't there 500,000 bird species? Why are there so few bird species? Why are there so few cat species, dog species? Go ahead, David.
I don't quite understand the answer. I don't quite understand the question you're asking me.
So if we're seeing new species today, as you can see here, new species has evolved, and we're making testable predictions. Okay, this is exactly what's funny is Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, he made the prediction. He said, I predict 2 to 3 new bird species a year for 4,500 years would add up to the 10,000 bird species we see today. Boom, just half a year later, this new paper comes out, new bird species on the Galapagos Island. There's one. It's not hard to imagine another bird species somewhere on this planet. So these are direct predictions that can help us differentiate the kinds and ancestry. Because if evolution is true, it's totally opposite expectations. If we're seeing today, in the present, new bird species, but according to the evolutionary model of deep time ancestry, birds evolved from theropod dinosaurs roughly 65 million years ago. That's 65 million years of speciation events. Why are there only 10,000 bird species today? Why so little species if evolution is true, David?
Uh, well, you got to understand exactly how species forms. Some when you talk about mammals, mammals take a long time to speciate. Bacteria and others speciate much quicker because their populations are also they divide pretty quickly. I'm gonna pull something up real quick.
Well, do you
Trying to
know if
find it.
well, if you can see here, look at this. I'm just using birds as an example. We can look at cats, 37 species, because you're saying, how can you get all these thousands of species from a handful of kinds on the ark? And I'm showing you it's very plausible. It's easy to explain. We're making predictions. We're seeing new species form today. But I need to point out a fact to the audience. The species we see forming today are resulted from shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. It's reduction in genetic variability. And that's exactly what is predicted based on the creation model. We're looking at reduction in allelic potential versus the evolutionist. You go back millions and millions of years to your first single cell ancestor. That's going to require the expansion of genetic information. So the speciation events we see are opposite of the types of speciation events that evolutionists would need. So for example, look at this: lizard species, snake species. So snakes, we've got 3,600 known species in the world. We've got just over 4,000 lizard species today. That's only less than one a year for the snakes, a little bit more than one a year for the lizards. This is exactly what's expected based on our model of 4,500 years for these species to come about. Why are there so few? If deep time evolution is true, we should be seeing hundreds of thousands of species, David.
Well, again, I'm going to answer this with a question, and you'll see where I'm going with this. So we're going to take a rate 2 to 3 new bird species. So over the past 20 to 30 years, we should have like 60 new species in 30 years. So where exactly are they? So you see, speciation
Good question.
and new species obviously aren't a constant. You do get instances where speciation happens quite rapidly, especially after extinction events. There's been, I think, 5 or 6 mass extinction events in Earth's history, and certain effects that there's a species are separated for whatever reason, if they migrate or if a new barrier is formed between them, then they start separating pretty quickly. So yeah, speciation doesn't happen at a constant rate. So again, if we're taking your constant rates of 2 to 3 new bird species, we should see like 60 new species over the past 20 to 30 years.
Right. So good question. So we've just started in the last 100 years actually looking for new species, documenting new species, for example. We're seeing, as you can see here, a new bird species has evolved on the Galapagos Island. This is in real time on the Galapagos Island because we've got people there studying Darwin's finches, of course. This is an icon of Darwinism, for example. So because we just started documenting new species, the Earth is a massive place. There's a lot of parts on this Earth that we're not directly observing, studying, analyzing. Therefore, we are already seeing new bird species before our very own eyes on islands and places on the Earth that we're actually directly studying and analyzing. So it's not hard to believe that there's 1 or 2 more somewhere on the planet. Now, here's the key, though. We're making the testable predictions. We're the ones that are actually saying, okay, roughly species have accumulated at a semi-consistent rate since the flood, and we're making predictions on species of birds, canids, felines, lizards, snakes, bats. Where's bats here? Rabbit species. I mean, bats, there's only 1,240 species of bats. So here's the thing. We're making the predictions. Evolutionists, and we can move on to another topic after that if you want, but here's the point. Evolutionists, they're not making predictions on speciation rates, and this is why, because you just said it. There's too many factors. They assume extinction events. They assume that species are not forming. consistently, just like the molecular clocks. They're not making predictions on molecular clocks because, well, there's too many factors at play. The molecular clock has slowed down in the past. It's faster now, but it was slower in the past. Species are not forming at a consistent. So it's just excuse after excuse after excuse with the evolutionary community. Biblical creationists are looking at this data and saying, okay, here's some testable predictions. They're on print for us to test and falsify. You're talking about falsifiability, and boom, new species of bird before our very own eyes. So go ahead, David.
All right, sure. So I want to respond. Let's say right now it's estimated that there are about 8.7 million species alive today. Would you agree with that?
How many?
About 8.7 million.
So we've got insects alone are about 1 million of those. Mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds, I think, are roughly about 34,000 species. And aquatic, you've got about tens of thousands of species. So really, when it comes to like your mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds that we'd have to explain from the ark, there's really only thousands. But I do believe, yeah, there's roughly over 1 million species altogether if you want to consider insects and things like that.
Yeah, so 8.7 million species, and we're going to divide that by 4,500 years. That's 1,933 species per year, or about 5 species per day, according to your model. So again, where's that 5 species per day? Again, this is why you can't say that speciation happens at a constant rate. That's why a model that looks at speciation at a constant rate simply doesn't work.
Right, but you're like I said, you're calculating the insects in there, for example. Those didn't need to go on the ark. You're looking at the. What's that?
Insects didn't need to go on the ark. Okay, why didn't they need to go on the ark? You don't think the spiders and bees and wasps and all that, they weren't on the ark?
Well, a lot of your insects breathe through their skin through sphericals, for example. So yeah, it's debated amongst theologians, but I mean the consensus for the most part is insects didn't have to go onto the ark. But let's just say, just for sake of argument, say they had to. Insects can you can get thousands of insects just by accident on the ark, on the animals, for example. They can be floating around on log mats. Like your math just seems like it's totally off when it comes to, because I'm showing you when you actually just analyze the species themselves, they're all, because you can't just say, okay, here's every single species, here's how many you have to have. We have to look at the actual species. Like if we think the birds, there's a few different kinds there. Boom, do the speciation rates match up? Here's are you familiar with this paper with the barcodes that they looked at across 100,000 species? You can see it on the screen.
I'm not familiar with that paper.
So yeah, it's even one of the researchers. He said the conclusion is very surprising, and I fought against it as hard as I could. So let me just make one point. I'll give you the last word on this topic, just because this is good. We're discussing this, but at the same time, the burden of proof is on you tonight for human evolution. So I don't want to spend too much time on the biblical model of speciation, but to get those numbers of species, if those DNA differences are built in from the start. Okay, we don't need millions of years to explain the DNA diversity because it's already built in. You can see here on the slide, time is not required for diversity today because it can be designed in Adam and Eve and the original kind. So just through processes like recombination, boom, shuffle around those alternatives and DNA variants. That's what we do with breeds. We've got over 750 breeds of horses that have come into existence during human history. Even the evolutionists will agree to that, and that's not through mutation. So just recombination, gene conversion, then you got to get a breakaway population, inbreeding, isolation, shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity, boom, you got some new species. It's my point, and I think the data that I'm showing here, it's my point that the number of species we see today can easily come from a handful of ark kinds off of the ark 4,500 years ago. And I feel there's far too many inconsistencies in the evolutionary model. That's why they can't make predictions on speciation rates when in fact we're the ones that are making the testable predictions. And we know that the gold standard of science is to make testable and falsifiable predictions. So go ahead, Dave. I'm going to give you the last word on the speciation. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, sure. So like, as I said before, you can't make a constant speciation, right? Because it doesn't work. There's too many variables involved. And you're saying the insects don't necessarily have to go in the ark. Well, here's an experiment for you. Next time you see a spider or two, pick it up, put it in a bucket of water, and squish it around and see what happens. There's no way that insects are going to survive a 170-day long journey on the ark, and then overfoot. There's no way that they're going to survive. And the Bible itself says that creeping things were on the ark. Again, you have to ignore the Bible in order to say that insects were not on the ark. Another problem that you have is that you said that there were could have been thousands of animals, thousands of insects on the ark accidentally. Again, how did that happen? Isn't God a omnipotent God there? And so, yeah, as I said, speciation is not constant. And again, you're shifting the burden of proof as well, and all. So there is one thing that I do want to touch on. I think we spent enough time talking about this. You talked about an analogy of the different cars and nested hierarchies. I do want to touch on that real quick. This is a fallacy known as the false equivalence fallacy. It is false equivalence because, again, cars, cell phones, stuff like that, they don't have genetic information for them to reproduce and pass on your information to. Biological organisms do. So again, you're committing the fallacy of false equivalence. Again, how do you know if something is a common designer or a common ancestor, and all that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so good questions. I just want to give you as much time as you need there. So one last point, I guess, on the insects. Yeah, I mean, I've got insects in my house. You can go outside, you can come back inside, and you've got insects all over you. They breed like crazy. I mean, bees, the mother bee, I think, gives birth to thousands and thousands of bees. I mean, insects are not really the issue there. If they did accidentally get onto the ark, I mean, I don't see why God would have to prevent such a thing. I mean, they can easily be on the backs of some of these animals. For example, they could be on log mats, so they don't all have to be drowning. But when it comes to the reptiles, the amphibians, the bird, well, I said I'd give you the last word on that. So we can do a whole debate on speciation. But when it comes to the question that you just had with how do we identify design, for example, and you're saying that the nested hierarchical analogy that I've given is a false equivalency. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's false equivalency because you can't. They don't have any genetic information to reproduce and pass on their genetic information. Biological organisms do.
Okay. Yeah, no, I get your point. So the reason, and real quick before I answer that, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Just make sure. Thank you, Praise. So we start from a hypothesis, okay? So we've got our created heterozygosity hypothesis. Now, we would look at nested hierarchical patterns that we can see in the biological world. We can see it on a molecular level. We can see it in our nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA. We can see nested patterns in third position, codon variation. I mean, nested hierarchies are the rule, for example. But here's the thing is, we're saying that based on a design perspective, the Bible tells us that we're made in his image. Therefore, we should hypothetically be able to get a sense for how he designed the biological world by how we design things, modes of transportation. We can even go into programming, for example, functions, subfunctions. Do these design things fall in nested hierarchical patterns? Now, it could have been the fact that they don't. It's just all random. It's totally opposite to the biological world. And then we'd have to tap out and say, well, this is really inconsistent. This is weird. But it just so happens to be that we accidentally build in nested hierarchical patterns. We program in nested hierarchical patterns. And this is a reflection of that initial created heterozygosity hypothesis. But it's not it's not post hoc ad hoc, because now we're like, okay, let's make some testable predictions on DNA function, for example. Let's see if we can break this hierarchy. And we often point to the existence of orphan genes that have no trace of ancestry. They just pop up. They're highly functional. It's even highly functional, specific to the organisms, for example. And there's no real hierarchy when it comes to orphan genes. So, my question back to you is, if you have a problem with that and you think it's a false equivalence, but it's just funny because it could have turned out that we don't build in nested hierarchical patterns, and then the evolutionists wouldn't have to be so defensive about it. But yeah, throwing it back to you, how would you explain the existence of, say, orphan genes, which have no real pattern that can be found in the biological world? How do you explain that inconsistency, David?
Sure. Hold on one moment as I pull up my paper here.
Actually, if you want to take your time pulling that up and give a brief minute explanation, I just have to run upstairs real quick, but I can hear what you're saying, so don't worry. Just take your time in your explanation, okay, David?
Yeah, just pulling up my stuff here. I had a whole thing about orphan genes here, and I completely lost my spot. Yeah, I cannot find my paper. I think the best thing for that is just to do a response video, because I cannot find my stuff.
Okay, well, see, here's the issue is, I'm going to go on record here and say that there really is no real answer from the evolutionists when it comes to something like these taxonomically restricted and essential genes, because you can watch several of, and it's not a bad thing. It's nothing against anybody, but I've asked this question and brought forth this observation line of evidence numerous times. I brought it up to, Guts at Gibbon. I brought it up recently to Conspiracy Cats for a second time. And it's typically the same thing, right? I'll make a response video. Here's the fact. It actually is inconsistent with the evolutionary model, and it's perfectly consistent with the model of biblical ancestry, separate ancestry. This is exactly what we would expect. These taxonomically restricted genes that defy universal ancestry. Like these genes really are, as I pointed out in the opening, they're unique sets of coding sequences, and they're specific to particular organisms, and they show no consistent hierarchy. And the explanation from the evolutionist side is de novo gene synthesis. Oh, these popped up from non-coding regions to become highly functional and important to living organisms, when in fact that's just circular, because they see the orphan genes exist. Now they need an explanation. Boom, they toss out the explanation, which I just say is a rescue device. And the reason they have that rescue device is because they know orphan genes exist. So it's a big circle. But I don't want to beat a dead horse on that one, but you can respond real quick. And I wanted to share screen again on the haplogroups that you were talking about earlier. Go ahead, David. If you want to give a response to that.
Okay, sure. But I guess one question I do have is that each species, like even species within a kind, such as cats, such as lions and tigers, don't they have their own unique orphan genes?
Right. So good question. Yeah, that's definitely an interesting challenge. So, for example, a lot of these orphan genes, though, they can be lost over time. We've seen that in the lab. And here's something to consider. Just like the non-coding RNA genes, how even pseudogenes are oftentimes only expressed under certain conditions. We're now finding that with the orphan genes as well. And, this is where environmental related adaptation and change and epigenetics comes into play as well. But generally, the rule is there's no consistent hierarchy. We've got a little bit of work to do regarding the specifics of the orphan genes and how we can break down the kinds. We're also looking at taxonomically restricted endogenous retroviruses. So we just know so little of the DNA language at this point. But two things, they can be lost since the original creation, and some are only expressed under certain conditions like pseudogenes. So that's a good question.
Yeah, so my question, so I guess a good follow-up question would then be, so if each species within a kind, quote unquote, have their own orphan genes and can be related, then how can you possibly use that against common descent? Because if you say that lions and tigers are all the same kind and they have a common ancestor, then, but each of them have their own unique orphan genes. So how can you use that against common descent when you have that issue within your own model?
Oh, actually, this is a good point, and this is, I'm glad you brought that up. So, unfortunately, like I was discussing it with Emo in a comment section recently, and it misses the entire point, because it's the fact that orphan genes, the existence of them being taxonomically restricted and yet essential, and there's no explanation for how they came about. Boom, that's one. They defy universal ancestry because there's no consistent hierarchy. Now we got to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more technical, and analyze and examine the data and say, okay, how can we use this to determine the exact kind boundary? Now, I'm going to go on record and say I believe it's DNA function and molecular clocks that can really answer this question of ancestry. But the orphan genes and the taxonomically restricted endogenous retroviruses, they have a part to play because they at least show inconsistencies in universal common ancestry. But orphan genes alone are not going to answer the question of exactly what is a kind. It can give us an idea, because now we know, okay, there obviously is independent ancestries because of the existence of these orphan genes. Now let's look to molecular clocks, DNA function. Let's make some predictions. It's not just a one line of evidence proves all. There's a number of lines of evidence that we're using that can corroborate each other, would be the point. So if you want, you can respond and have the last word to that one, David. I appreciate the back and forth on this topic.
Yeah, sure. So obviously the question is, you would talk about some orphan genes being lost. Couldn't we just use the same excuse with humans and chimps? They were just lost. I mean, come on, there's no real way to falsify that, right?
Well, see, here's the question though. You would have to, if it's easier to track which, how were these lost, which lineages were they lost from, or maybe they're just not expressed, for example. But the bigger question is, how did they come about to begin with? And that's where the evolutionists are struggling, because they're seeing that there's no consistent hierarchy. They're seeing that these are also functional DNA elements important to our genomes. Therefore, how did they come about? And you can read in these papers, it's, they assume, there could have been de novo origin, de novo gene synthesis. But the question is, why should we believe that to be the case if there's no direct observation of a non-coding region of our genome popping up and becoming functional and important? But the big picture is they are inconsistent with a hierarchy. They show no consistent hierarchy, which is exactly what we would expect based on the separate ancestry hypothesis. And like I said, you can have another word on that one, but can you see my screen as well, real quick?
Right now, I cannot see your screen.
Oh, Praise, as you're responding, I'll make sure Praise can share it.
Okay. I see your screen now. So
because you were talking about the haplogroups earlier, mitochondrial DNA variants, for example, the L node, I guess according to the evolutionary model. But how would you explain, if you see here, right, you can see that there's the three major haplogroups. You got L, M, and N. Now, this was derived by Dr. Nathaniel Jensen based on a number of mitochondrial DNA variants. And the evolutionary community even agrees with these three major haplogroups. Well, what's funny is it's consistent with our model, because you were pointing out earlier that we would have all descended from three founding couples, Noah's three daughters-in-law and their sons. Now, guess what? Mitochondrial DNA, as you know, is only inherited and passed down from our mothers, for example. So we can actually see here, boom, you got your three major haplogroups. You've got your subnodes as well, for example, which is consistent with the Babel dispersion. So once again, we look at the mitochondrial DNA itself, we look at the genetics itself, and we see how consistent it is with a biblical-based model. And we don't even have to use the phylogeny-based assumption. So what are your thoughts on this mitochondrial DNA tree? Do you find it fascinating? What would be your objections to it, for example? Go ahead, David.
Sure. So from what I understand, there's four major haplogroups, not three, correct?
No, there'd be three major. You can see here they're separated by short lines. They're right in the center. 1, 2, 3, L, M, and N. You've got subnodes. You've got haplogroups, for example, but your three major ones would be right here, where you can see all the for example, the lines would be a marker of time, for example, based on DNA differences. But yeah, go ahead. What are your, like, this being exactly what would be expected from our model. And guess what? These differences here separating the three major haplogroups, these differences should be mutations pre-flood. And yet, what do we see? We only see a few mutations separating the three major nodes. And this makes sense, because these three women, which we say are Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wives, they would have come from a world where only a few generations have lived before them. And then you can see from these three major nodes here, if you're looking through, you can see my mouse here, you can see that these three major nodes emit dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants. You can see each at a relatively greater distance from the three major haplogroups themselves. And that's exactly what we would expect, because we would expect rapid dispersal at the Tower of Babel, with dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants now emerging from those three major haplogroups. So the short lines you'd see here as pre-flood times, the longer lines obviously would be post-flood times, but testable predictions flow from this chart too. Dr. Jensen has made predictions on the history of civilization, for example. If this chart here, these mitochondrial DNA variants really have all originated within 4,500 years, then Dr. Jensen's saying, okay, we should be able to find genetic signatures and stamps in the mitochondrial DNA itself that confirm a history of 4,500 years, and he's actively researching that. So once again, the biggest point to take from it, David, is creationists, they're making testable and falsifiable predictions, which is the gold standard of science. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, so I think that'll be another good video to do a series on his work. I think that'll be another great series to work on. It is about 1:23 my time. There's been a lot of questions in the chat room, so do you just want to go straight to Q&A?
You know what? That's a good idea there, David. I think we pretty much, anyways, we at least covered all the questions that you had for the most part. But yeah, we can do some response videos after, even do a third debate later. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the respectfulness of the conversation. So praise, if you want to get to the questions. Actually, you know, since you're my guest here, David, on the program, why don't you give a few final words on how you think the debate went? If there's a few things you wanted to address that you felt like you didn't address, why don't you have just a quick concluding statement on how you think the debate went? Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, sure. I think the debate went pretty well. I definitely think it went a lot better than our last debate. I think I was pretty respectful the whole way through, and I think you were very respectful as well. Praise, of course, is an excellent moderator and also a great debater. And hopefully we can schedule a debate on radiometric dating next. I think that should be our next debate, and then maybe we could do a debate on Noah's flood.
Heck yeah, that'd be great, guys.
Awesome. I appreciate that there, David, and I agree. It was a respectful, profitable dialogue. I think we touched on a number of topics. We've had a large audience tonight with some good questions, so you can't really go wrong with that. Go ahead, Praise. Take it away.
So, our first super chat is from George Baum for $5. We appreciate your donation and your contribution to this channel, George. He says Evos are now claiming there may have been more than one Luca. Where do they get all this from?
One more, Luca. I'm not quite sure what they're talking about. I'm not quite sure what they're referencing to.
You can respond to that, SFT.
So the last universal common ancestor, are they referring to the bush now that it's not really a tree of life, it's more of a bush of life?
Yeah, Evos are now claiming there may have been more than one Luca. Where do they get all this from?
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. I'll have to research it a little bit, but that is a good question and something that I will definitely look into. Just looking here on Plus Genetics. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for your answers there. So this is Stupid Horror Energy for $5. She's trying to
Horror Energy in the house. Always a pleasure to have her in the chat. Thanks for joining us.
She says there are actually 18,000 species of bird. It doubles from time to time.
So with my source here, it's roughly 10 to 12,000, 18,000 as well. If that's the case, I mean, I'd have to see that source. The source I have here is about 10. I usually say give or take a couple thousand. And even considering extinction events, it's still perfectly in line with all the species of birds, even if it's 18,000 coming from a handful of birds on the ark. It would have only been a couple thousand years after creation. They would have had those front-loaded, pre-existing functional DNA differences that would have helped lead to the origin of species post-flood. So whether it's 10 to 18,000, those predictions still apply. They're in print by creationists. When in fact, if deep time evolution was true, they'd have to invoke a lot of extinction events to account for why there are so few bird species, why there are so few lizard species, snake species, cat species, dog species, bear species, far too few for deep time evolution to be true. And yeah, they say there's this factor and that factor, but that's just an excuse to not make testable predictions. And no testable predictions means non-science. So go ahead, you can have a word there, David.
The last, I was just looking up as well. I only saw one paper saying that there was 18,000 species. 10,000 or 18,000 species doesn't really change anything in the long run. I agree with you. It doesn't really change anything.
So I have a quick rejoinder to so it's the Luca question from George Bond. He says it was from Emo, suggested that there was more than one Luca. So that's where he got it from.
Okay.
So this is from Shadow Dancer. This might be our biggest contribution yet. So thank you so much, Shadow Dancer. That's
thank you, Shadow Dancer.
Very generous. That's a $20. That's awesome. You did a Shadow. So this is to address to David. There isn't 8 million species that is estimated. Known as 1.3 million bacteria, plants, trees, fungi, fish, corals included, amphibians, birds, mammals, reptilian species, and not kind add to 29,811. How the argument of speciation is valid. Insects survive on floating debris. But that is kind of...
Is that a mouthful or what?
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
I don't quite understand. Could you actually put that in the private chat here so I can read the question? Because I'm trying to figure out... It'll probably be easiest for me just if I can read the question myself.
It's you might have to decipher it a little bit.
Yeah, because I'm trying to decipher point by point.
And I appreciate the super chat there, Jesse. Jesse, great job in your debate today on Modern Day Debate. I recommend people have a look at it. Good job, Jesse. Looks like it's on the side chat there, David, if you wanted to read it and take your time to answer it.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
And guys, stay tuned next week,
Yeah.
July 9th, Ken Hovind versus Ron Garrett. So, okay, if you're ready there, David, go ahead.
Yeah, David, there is an 8 million species that is estimated, known as 1.3 million. Actually, yeah, I'm not quite sure how the argument of speciation valid species, insect species, on floating debris. Don't quite understand the question. And again, I highly doubt insects are going to be able to survive for 170 days on a flood, on floating debris. Again, just do the experiment yourself. Take some insects, put it in a pool of water, and swirl it up in recreating the flood issue. And yeah, they're not going to survive. In fact, let me pull up the Bible real quick. This is 8. I believe it's Genesis 8. But yeah, Genesis is pretty clear that the creeping things, insects, were on the ark, and it clearly says in Genesis 8 verse 13, in the 600 year, in the first month, or the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked and saw that the base of the ground was drying. And the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God said to Noah, bring out of the ark you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, of all the birds, of all the flesh, birds and animals, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, i.e. the insects, so that they may abound on the earth and may be fruitful and multiply. So Noah went out with his sons and his wives and his son's wife, and every animal and every creeping thing and every bird, everything that moved on the other went out. So it's pretty clear that insects were on the ark. And it's also pretty clear that anything that was not on the ark was killed. Let me pull this back.
So if I could have a quick response, yeah. So for example, she's kind of pointing out that when you break it down, when you look at mammals, reptiles, amphibians, bird, you're looking at roughly 34, maybe 35,000 species. Insects, you'd be looking at about 1 million species. Aquatic, you've got tens of thousands of species. So you're really only looking at about 1.6 million species on Earth. 1.3 to 1.6 million, which are easily explained from the art kinds 4,500 years ago. When it comes to the creeping things, there's debate among theologians and experts, of course, if that's just referring to like snakes and lizards and reptiles, for example, or is it also talking about insects? There's a debate based on the whether they're truly living in the biblical sense, based on the fact that they do breathe through their skin, through structures called sphericals, for example. But hypothetically, even if they were needed on the ark, 1 million species today from probably a lot of. I mean, you could bring almost unlimited insects onto the ark. They're so small. I don't really see why that would be an issue. 1 million species of insects today from a whole large number of them from the ark, and then even if they didn't have to go on, they would accidentally go on. For example, I think they wouldn't be a problem surviving log mats, for example. But the biggest point to take away is there's really only 1.3 to 1.6 million species on this planet. We break it down like I did during the debate. We can see that testable predictions can flow, since there's really only a few species of birds, bears, dogs, cats, reptiles, snakes, bats, rabbits. I mean, you go down the line, it's all consistent with biblical speciation. Now, it was your question in your super chat, David. Therefore, you get the last word on that one. Go ahead.
Yeah, but of course, I don't think anything really changes that much, because if I say let's say there are 6,400 mammal species, extant species, doesn't count the ones that are extinct, but 6,400 species of mammal, that's 1 species of mammal pretty much every single day since the flood. And 1.6, let's say 1.6 million species. That's 355 species a day, which is about one every couple days. So again, the explanation doesn't change. The idea that the idea that speciation is always constant certainly doesn't work.
Thank you, David, for your and also SFT. But something incredible just came in that this blows my mind. Alex Cox just gave us a super chat for $75.
Wow, Alex, we are gonna retire. No, seriously, we appreciate we appreciate the support, brother. As you know, it's our goal of this ministry to one day do it full time. So we appreciate all the help and support we can get. So Alex, thanks so much, brother, and God bless to you for that.
Yes, God bless you. I've never even seen that color on a super chat before. This pink color.
I'm screenshotting that one for sure.
He's in his own category with that one. That's easily, I think, the highest you ever had on this channel.
100%. David, look at that. You bring the numbers. We got to have you on here more often.
Yeah.
Yeah, bring me on next week for the radiometric debate.
All right, so now we're done the super chats of right now. So we're gonna go to regular questions now. This is from Science is Observable. Evos are now claiming there may have been more than one. Wait a minute, I thought I already did that one. Where do they get? Okay, I'm gonna get to the next one. So this is from Science is Observable again. So, question for evolutionists: what differences between us and Lucy exist? And what makes Lucy stand out as possible evidence for human evolution?
So that is an excellent question. So there's a lot of differences between Lucy and humans, and I think Standing for Truth did a pretty good job highlighting some of the issues that makes it pretty clear that, according to him, that she was an ape and was not a human. Chief among them are the small brain sizes and some of the other anatomical features as well. She was also pretty short, and a lot of other different things as well. But the main one is the brain size.
David, real quick, I'm just curious if you were aware of the issue that I can't remember exactly how many years it was. I'd have to pull up the source, but they accidentally had a baboon bone, I think it was, part of the Australopithecus afarensis, until just recently they realized that, oops, they had a baboon bone in there the entire time, and they had to kind of come out and admit that mistake, just kind of showing how interpretive and how flawed the whole fossil record really is. Here it is. So it was 40 years. A baboon bone was incorrectly assigned to Lucy. Were you aware of that one, David?
I'm not quite familiar, but just if I can see that point, this is a good example of science correcting itself. Yes, mistakes do happen, and we gladly admit them. And science is always about taking what we learned and revising our models and correcting past mistakes. So if that's the case, and that's a perfect example of science doing what it's supposed to do, correcting itself.
Yeah, I do appreciate that they corrected themselves. That's for sure. That's why I always say, hey, listen, you've always got papers and articles coming out about the next big finding. This finding proves human evolution or something, and it's like, listen, they're correcting things that were, like, for example, this baboon bone was incorrectly assigned to Lucy for 40 years. So therefore, say you get some big paper that comes out in 2017, it's like, give it a little bit of time. How long did it take before Piltdown Man was realized to be a hoax? Or how long did it take to realize that some of the hominids like Australopithecus sediba and Homo habilis had a jumbled mixture of Homo bones in there as well, So it's just like, just kind of hold off for a bit. Let's see if these lines of evidence actually can hold to scrutiny. Because if they're correcting things after 40 years, right? So that's just my point, really.
Right, and of course, all sciences, and that's why I love science and observation, is that you are free to make hypotheses and you're always open to revision. It doesn't mean that your idea was completely wrong before, but that's all how science progresses. A good example within the atomic theory of matter, look how many times that model has been revised and each time it's revised we get a better understanding of how the atoms work and all of that. So the same is true with evolution and the same is true in biology.
Right. Good point. Science is a self-correcting field. Yeah. Good point. Praise. Any more questions? Or
Yeah, we have a few more. And we have a comment first from Alex Cox. He says, we know that Lucy was a complete fake like Piltdown Man, the famous pig's tooth with Nebraska Man. You guys can respond to that.
Yeah, I can definitely respond to that. Lucy was definitely not a fake. She was very real. And as I mentioned in my PowerPoint slide, her species, Australopithecus afarensis, um, I'm probably not saying that right. We have found dozens upon dozens of different specimens as well. So again, when you have multiple independent lines of evidence saying the same thing, that is positive evidence in that person's and that line of evidence favor. Um, so when we have dozens of different specimens of the Lucy species, um, you see that it's pretty clear that that was a real species. Lucy was definitely not faked.
Yeah, I would say, as I pointed out, that the Australopithecines were just an extinct ape genus. I think Lucy, for example, was probably just a chimp-like animal that spent most of her time in the trees, who probably did walk a little bit more erect than other tree-dwelling primates. There's some uniqueness to her morphology, so I have no problem with a type of creature like the Australopithecines existing. Pre-flood and maybe even post-flood, because we do find often like the Laetoli foot tracks. We find foot tracks in Crete that often look like anatomically modern human footprints living alongside the Australopithecines. So how and when they went extinct, I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, I have no problem with the Australopithecines existing. So that would be my take on it.
So of course you would agree, standing that Lucy is real. She was a real.
Yes. Yes. Oh yeah.
Okay, good. And of course, I also highlighted several of the significant differences with chimps. She did not walk on her knuckles and stuff like that. They were totally bipedal. So again, they were definitely not a chimp.
Right. That's why I always that's why I say it would just be an extinct ape genus. Like if the Australopithecines were alive today, it would just be considered a fourth hominid genus. That because even your ape species today share many sets of features with each other, but then there's also some unique features as well. Just like the Australopithecines, they share many sets of features with all the different ape species, but they also have some unique features. So that's just my take on it. But I think the commoner, maybe because the bamboon bone, for example, that was incorrectly assigned to Lucy. So yeah, there would be some discrepancies, a bone here, a bone there, that are accidentally classified in with the wrong species. But that wouldn't negate the existence of the Australopithecines. There definitely was some creatures out there that we refer to as the Australopithecines. So yeah, I've got no problem with that.
Yeah.
All
Sure.
right, so thank you for your answers there. And now this is Gavin Hurlman, Brother Gavin, and he says, question for both. Isn't the billion millions of years a defeater for evolution because of the second law of thermodynamics?
Excellent question, and I guess I'll start. And the answer to that question is no, because Earth is an open system. It gets its energy from the sun. Therefore, the second law of thermodynamics only applies in a closed system. Just like I can clean my room, and I can clean the bathroom and change the entropy level, so to speak, turning the disorderly room into a more orderly room. That's because the room is an open system with me providing extra energy to come in and fix it up. Same way with the sun. The sun provides energy to the earth, and thus the second law of thermodynamics doesn't necessarily apply here.
Can you repeat that question again? I think I know what he's saying, but I just want the exact question.
Yes, this is from Gavin Hurlman, and he says, question for both, isn't the billion millions of years a defeater for evolution because of the second law of thermodynamics?
Right. So yeah, the second law of thermodynamics is essentially the law of increasing entropy. I typically use that argument to say that, hey, listen, if we've got a law that's stating that things are winding down, for example, we can take back this current entropy that we have to a point of least increasing entropy. And the fact that your first law of thermodynamics states that matter and energy cannot be created. Yeah, there can be conversions there, for example, from matter to energy, but they cannot be created. Combined with the second law of thermodynamics, the law of increasing entropy, boom, it takes you right back to a point of creation where matter and energy would have had to come into existence. And the evolutionists that would say that, the universe is eternal, well, that's impossible because of the second law. Since things are winding down. And that's why when we talk about genetic entropy, when we're looking at it at a biological level, our genomes are winding down. As David pointed out, when I wake up in the morning, my hair is everywhere. I look like a mess, for example, or my house. If you just left your house the way it was, it would get messy. You gotta clean it yourself. Your car would get rusty. Things don't get better on their own, of course. So, that'd be my answer.
Very good. Thanks for your answers. This is from Science is Observable. Question for evolutionists. How do you explain the origin of human consciousness?
All right, excellent question. And that is more, I think, philosophy than science. I don't think we fully understand the nature of consciousness, and that is perfectly okay. But the best explanation that I can give is that consciousness is basically a result of the chemical interactions within the neurons and within your brain. And that is the significant driving factor of consciousness. Now, of course, that being said, we are very far from understanding the nature of consciousness. We are very far from understanding what actually qualifies as someone that is sentient or not sentient. That is something that is definitely a good question and one that I really don't have a very good answer for.
So you want to respond to that? Gosh, I almost called you Moderator Debate, standing for truth.
No, that's okay. I mean, it was specifically his question. I'm fine with not responding to that one.
Okay, so this is our very last question from Redefine Living. I have a question for David. If the evolutionary theory allows monkeys to surf between continents, why can't others? It's cut out there. Oh no.
Okay, I saw the question in the chat and I know what she's saying, and I love this question. I have a very good feeling that I had an idea of what she is saying, and I believe the answer she's looking for is called plate tectonics, and and of course, the continents haven't always been the way that they are today, and as the continents separated, the species that were living on that part of the continent drifted off with it. So that's kind of the way that I'm understanding. No one, monkeys weren't surfing on the ocean, not by a long shot.
I kind of caught the end of that. Yeah, they'll say, because oftentimes they'll say, how did the animals migrate after the after the ark to their respective locations. Kangaroos, for example, marsupials. Evolutionists oftentimes use the same explanations when it comes to, rafts and land bridges, for example. And they also say that monkeys would have rafted, I believe, to America. You can. I've got a paper here that says that kind of goes over it a little bit. Monkeys to America. Yeah, crew of prehistoric monkeys rafted across the Atlantic to South America. So you can. How did the monkeys come to the Americas? So yeah, just you can have a look. The monkeys that sailed across the Atlantic to South America. So that is kind of humorous, actually. But yeah,
Yeah, I'm highly skeptical of such an explanation, but I will have to dig into it.
All right. Well, that is the end of the question. So, do you guys want to conclude some of the concluding statements, or?
I think I'm good here. Just once again, thank you so much for standing for this excellent debate. I hope you found that I was a decent debater. I think I did a lot better this debate than I did in our previous debate. And Praise, thank you so much for being an outstanding moderator as always.
I appreciate it, brother.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed this debate. When I was watching and listening to your opening, I got excited. I said, here's a lot of good questions, a lot of good points and challenges. And I wasn't wrong. It was a fruitful discussion. I hope I answered, all of the questions. If anyone feels like I didn't in the audience, just let me know, shoot me an email. I'll do my best to do so after the fact. But yeah, I really enjoyed this debate. I love this topic on human evolution. I love studying both sides of the argument on this issue. So yeah, good job, David. And thanks for doing it. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I think I definitely am looking forward to my debates with Mr. Hovind, and I'm definitely looking forward to our next debate on radiometric dating. Just curious, do you want to, since we have quite a big audience now, do you want to schedule that here while everyone's listening, or do you want to schedule that privately?
Good question. I do have a few now that I've done quite a lot of debates in the last 2 weeks. This was the last one I scheduled for 2 weeks, just to not be too overwhelmed. So now I've got a few people who want to debate me, and I'm going to be scheduling for the next 2 weeks. So we'll do it privately, and we'll see how we can fit that debate in amongst the rest of my debates. So yeah, good question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I really enjoyed our discussion, and I hope the listeners enjoyed our dialogue as well.
Thanks for all the super chats and questions, guys, in the audience. Hope you had fun. We've got a lot more fun this month. Like I said, we've got Kent and Ron Garrett next week, Kent and Dan Cardinal at the end of the month, and a few other ones that we're working on. So lots to look forward to. If you want to pick up our latest book from Team Standing for Truth, Universal or Separate Ancestry. We are going, because I know there's been some issues with people from Australia, so I'm going to work at getting a digital copy, a Kindle edition. And I really enjoyed this debate, actually. I was excited for it because I will be releasing probably next week a book specifically on this. So if you enjoyed the explanations when it came to the post-Babel dispersion, the people groups, the hominids, the accelerated genetic degeneration, all of these things you can find in this book. It's really extensive, technical, so that should be getting released next week. Yeah, so that's really all I got to say in terms of announcements. And
Oh, and related to that book, I know my friend Eno and myself are actually going to be making a series of videos responding to the book. So I'm going to hopefully pick up a copy. I don't know if you can send me a digital copy of it, and we're just going to go through and hopefully touch one and refute your book point by point. So that's one of the things that my friend and I are working on doing.
yeah, no, I'd appreciate that. That's why we're going to be working on a digital copy to be released, so people who might not be able to get Amazon to ship it to them, they can do the digital version. the one on human evolution I'll be releasing next week, along with another book titled Evolutionist Rescue Device with Raw Matt. We'll release those next week. They're a little bit more lengthy. This one was my goal. Well, it was universal or separate ancestry, biblical model of origins made easy. So I would appreciate, I'm hoping for as many rebuttals and objections from the evolutionists as possible. Therefore, when I finish the expanded edition, my goal is to address all the arguments. This one was more of my goal was to give a brief explanation of the model, especially for creationists to understand it. So yeah, I'd love for you guys to do a video series, and whatever objections I hear, I'll do my best to address them in the expanded edition. So I'm cool with that.
Yeah, totally. And I'm definitely looking forward to get my hands on your book.
Awesome. Well, yeah. So once again, thanks so much, David. Thanks to the audience. Thanks for moderating. Praise, you're the man with the plan. Praise, if you want to shut it down, brother, we are good to go.
Actually, we actually have a fan that has a question. Stupid Horror Energy is your fan. So she's asking, when are you going to come back on
I've
MDD?
been working hard to get her as a fan. It hasn't been easy.
When are you coming back on MDD, and we'll call a night.
Good question. I'm coordinating with James from Modern Day Debate to set up. There's a couple debates we have in mind. One being a pretty big one, but I don't want to say anything just yet till we can confirm it. But hopefully within the next few weeks, I would say.
All right. We'll call it a night here. I want to say good night. Keep sifting the truth from the untruth.
How dare you steal James' line there, Praise?
You just put truth.
You're getting sued.
Instead of reason, truth. You like it? Yeah, I like it. Good night, everyone.